a marriage meant for duty. Until the human rose as a god of war in the distant corners of the galaxy, the Vakar people were known for their strength, their technology, and their fierce pride. Their empire stretched across dozens of planets, and their warriors were the stuff of legends. But despite their power, the Vakar were at war, and the war was not going well. For centuries, they had fought against a series of aggressive alien races, and now a new threat, the Zarax, had appeared. These invaders were unlike anything the Vakar had faced before. The Vakar queen, Solara, was a woman of great power. Tall, with skin the color of deep obsidian and eyes that glowed like twin moons, she ruled with both strength and wisdom. But even she could not win this war alone. Her people's empire was crumbling, and no matter how hard she fought, it seemed there was no end in sight. In a desperate move, the Vakar had turned to humanity for help. The humans, though small in number compared to the mighty Vakar, had proved themselves to be fierce and resilient. In exchange for peace, the Vakar offered the humans a treaty, one that would see both races stand together against the growing Zarax threat. But the peace was not to be free. It came at a price. To seal the alliance, the Vakar queen, Solara, had been forced into a political marriage with a human. Her people expected this union to solidify the treaty, creating an image of unity between the two species. The choice was simple: marry the human diplomat, Liam Reynolds, or risk losing everything. It was a duty, a necessary sacrifice for the survival of her people. Liam Reynolds, on the other hand, was a man of quiet determination, not born for battle, but for diplomacy. He had served as an ambassador for Earth, a simple man chosen to represent humanity in this vast galaxy. When he was told he would be married to the Vakar queen, it came as a shock. He was a diplomat, not a king, not a warrior. He had never fought a battle in his life. But the war was bigger than his discomfort. Humanity's survival depended on this treaty, on this marriage. So Liam had accepted the role he had been given. He had been trained for diplomacy, for talks, for peace. But this was different. This was a forced union, a political maneuver to protect Earth and the Vakar, and he had no say in it. When he arrived on the Vakar homeworld, the sight was overwhelming. The planet was massive, covered in towering cities and endless fields of alien crops. The sky was filled with two suns that burned brightly, casting strange shadows on the ground. The air smelled of sweet spices, mixed with the faint scent of steel and smoke. Liam stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out at the vast city stretching below. He felt small, like a mere speck in the midst of this mighty empire. The palace itself was a place of grandeur and ancient tradition. Stone walls lined with intricate carvings, wide hallways with tall columns, and rooms filled with rare alien artifacts. But even within these walls, Liam could feel the weight of the marriage hanging over him. It was not love that had brought him here. It was duty. Solara, the queen of the Vakar, had already seen many things in her life, but never had she been faced with such a choice. She was a queen who had fought countless battles, led her people through hardships, and watched as her world teetered on the edge of destruction. She had made enemies, forged alliances, and seen her fair share of bloodshed. Yet this political marriage to a human, was unlike anything she had ever imagined. She stood at the altar, the ceremonial robes draped across her shoulders like the weight of the empire itself. Her eyes scanned the gathering crowd, each member of her court watching with expectant eyes. They wanted her to marry this human, to complete the alliance and bring an end to the war. They had no idea what it would cost her, what it would mean to marry a man she had never met, a man who was, by all accounts, not even a warrior. When Liam entered the room, all eyes turned to him. He was dressed in simple, formal attire, a sharp contrast to the grandeur of the Vakar's robes and armor. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes scanning the room, his heart racing. This was not a celebration. It was not a union of love. It was a political arrangement, and both he and the queen knew it. Solara's gaze met his for the first time. Her eyes were cold, unreadable, yet there was something about the way she looked at him that unsettled him. She was strong, powerful, yet distant. She seemed as much a stranger to him as he did to her. In that moment, Liam understood that this marriage would not be a simple one. There was no warmth between them, no connection, just the cold reality of duty. The ceremony was brief, without the fanfare that usually accompanied such unions. There were no words of love, no vows to cherish one another. Instead, there were only promises of alliance, of protection, and of strength. Solara, the queen of the Vakar, was now married to Liam Reynolds, the human diplomat. The crowd cheered, but Liam could hear the emptiness in the applause. This was not a joyous occasion. It was a necessary one. After the ceremony, the two of them stood together on the balcony, overlooking the city. The Vakar were celebrating their victory, but Liam's thoughts were elsewhere. What was he really here for? Was he meant to be a husband, a ruler, or just a tool in a game of politics? Solara stood beside him, her gaze distant, lost in her own thoughts. She had been forced into this marriage just as Liam had been. It was a duty she could not escape, but it was one that weighed heavily on her. The queen was not a woman who had ever needed help, but now here she was, bound to a man she barely knew. "You're not what I expected," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. Liam turned to look at her, surprised by the words. "And what did you expect?" Solara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gazed out at the stars, the distant lights twinkling in the sky like tiny flames. "I expected a king, or at least a warrior, not a diplomat." "I'm not a warrior," Liam said, his voice steady. "I'm a man who believes in peace. But if war is what's needed, then I will fight for it." She nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as if considering his words. "Perhaps we will need more than just peace." Liam didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their new roles. This was not the beginning of a love story. This was the beginning of something far more complicated. A marriage built on duty, not affection. But even in that silence, something stirred, something neither of them could yet understand. As the night wore on, they stood side by side, knowing the future was uncertain. They were bound together, not by love, but by necessity. And in the days to come, they would both learn that sometimes, even the most unlikely unions could change the course of history. The days following the marriage were filled with tension. Solara, as the Vakar queen, had many duties and responsibilities, and now that she was married to a human diplomat, she found herself divided between the needs of her people and the strange, unexpected presence of her new husband. Liam, too, was adjusting to his new life, though he felt more like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. Still, both knew the importance of their union, even if neither of them truly embraced it. At first, Liam spent his days in meetings with the Vakar leaders, offering his advice on diplomacy and strategy. He was more used to discussing trade routes and peace treaties than battle plans, but he had come prepared to do whatever was necessary. He had no choice but to work with the Vakar generals, though their respect for him was minimal. To them, he was still the human diplomat, not a military leader, not someone who could change the tides of war. Solara was not surprised by the cool reception Liam received from her people. She knew that many of her court saw him as nothing more than a tool to be used in the war, not someone to be admired or trusted. But as the days passed, she began to notice something about him that she had not expected: his resilience. Despite the cold treatment, Liam did not shy away from his role. He listened carefully to the Vakar leaders, offering suggestions that were simple yet effective. He wasn't an expert in warfare, but his mind was sharp. He could read people, understand their weaknesses, and find ways to turn situations in his favor. The Vakar generals, who had been used to fighting with brute force, found themselves slowly warming to his ideas. In one of the strategy meetings, Liam suggested a change in the Vakar tactics. Instead of continuing with their frontal assaults, which had been losing ground against the Zaraks, he proposed using the terrain to their advantage, leading the enemy into a trap where the Vakar could launch a surprise attack. His plan was simple, relying on stealth and precision rather than overwhelming strength. The generals were skeptical at first, but they were desperate, and they had nothing to lose. Solara, too, watched with quiet interest. The plan was executed a week later. As Liam had suggested, the Vakar forces lured the Zaraks into a narrow canyon where their numbers would be at a disadvantage. The Zaraks, confident in their strength, followed the Vakar right into the trap. The battle was swift, and to everyone's surprise, the Vakar emerged victorious. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For the first time, the Vakar leaders began to see Liam in a new light. He was no longer just a diplomat, no longer just the husband of their queen. He was proving himself as a tactician, someone whose advice could change the course of the war. The once cold and distant generals now sought his counsel, and even Solara found herself impressed by the man she had been forced to marry. However, despite the growing respect for him, Liam still felt like an outsider. He was not a Vakar, and no matter how many battles he helped win, he would never truly be one of them. His thoughts often drifted back to Earth, to the family and life he had left behind. He had been thrust into this conflict without warning, without preparation. He had never asked for this life, and yet here he was, leading an alien army against a powerful foe. Solara, too, was struggling with the changes in her life. The war was far from over, and every day brought new challenges. But she couldn't deny that Liam's presence was beginning to shift things. His success in the battle had not gone unnoticed, and his name was beginning to spread across the Vakar Empire. He was no longer just a symbol of the Alliance, he was becoming a symbol of hope. Yet even as she respected him more with each passing day, she still couldn't shake the feeling of duty that hung over their marriage. It was still an alliance built on necessity, not affection. Solara had always been a ruler, not a wife. She had led her people through countless battles, but now, with Liam by her side, she found herself questioning everything. Was this truly her path, or was she simply following the will of her people? One evening, after a long day of meetings, Solara and Liam found themselves alone in her private chambers. The room was large and adorned with the finest artifacts from across the galaxy. A fire crackled in the corner, casting a warm glow over the room. Solara sat by the window, looking out at the stars that filled the night sky. She could feel the weight of her crown on her head, though she had removed it for the evening. The crown was a symbol of her people's expectations, and those expectations were heavy. Liam stood by the door, unsure of what to say. It had been days since they had shared a meaningful conversation. The marriage between them had been political, but now, after the battle, things had shifted. There was a quiet understanding between them, but it was still fragile, like something that could break at any moment. "I've been thinking about Earth," Liam said quietly, breaking the silence. "I wonder what they think of all of this, the war, the treaty, me marrying you." Solara turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Earth didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I didn't ask for this life. I was just a diplomat trying to keep the peace. Now I'm leading armies, advising you on battle strategies. It feels like I'm not even in control of my own life anymore." Solara looked at him for a long moment. She understood the feeling all too well. She had never asked for the crown. She had never asked to be queen. It had been thrust upon her after the death of her father, and she had carried the burden ever since. But unlike Liam, she had never questioned her role. She had accepted it. Now she saw that he was struggling with his. "You're doing what needs to be done," Solara said softly. "Sometimes we don't have a choice in our roles. We must take what comes whether we want it or not." Liam shook his head. "It's not just about doing what needs to be done. It's about finding meaning in it, too. And right now, I'm not sure I see the meaning in any of this." Solara looked out the window again, her expression distant. She could see the stars, each one a world, a civilization, a possibility. The war against the Zarax had been long, and she had lost many soldiers. The peace she had once believed in now seemed like a distant dream. "You're not alone in this," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I may not have chosen this either, but I'm here, and I will fight for my people, for us." Liam glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For the first time, he saw the queen not as a ruler, but as a person, someone just as caught in the tides of fate as he was. "I don't know what the future holds," Liam said, "but I'll fight too. I'll fight for you, for your people, for Earth. But I'll also fight for what's right." Solara met his gaze, and for a moment they shared an unspoken understanding. The war was far from over, and the future was uncertain. But whatever came next, they would face it together. They were bound by duty, yes, but in that moment, something more began to grow between them. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something, an alliance of hearts, a shared understanding that they were not alone. The next day, the Vakar and human forces prepared for the next phase of the war. The tension was thick in the air, but now, as Liam stood beside Solara, he felt a new sense of purpose. The road ahead was still unclear, but at least now he had someone beside him who understood the weight of duty, the burden of leadership, and the quiet strength it took to keep moving forward. Together, they would fight for the future of the galaxy. And whatever came next, they would face it as allies, as leaders, and maybe, just maybe, as something more. The days following the victory over the Zarax were a strange mix of triumph and uncertainty. The Vakar people were celebrating, their warriors honored for their bravery, and the tactical genius of Liam Reynolds was praised across the Empire. The news of the unexpected victory spread like wildfire, carried by both Vakar messengers and human communications. It was the first real blow the Zarax had suffered in the war, and it sent a ripple of hope throughout the galaxy. But amidst the celebrations, Liam could not shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. He had fought in battles before, diplomatic battles where words were weapons. But never had he fought in a real war, never had he led soldiers into combat. Now he was more than just a diplomat. He was a commander, a figurehead for the alliance between humans and Vakar. And while the victories were sweet, he knew that this was just the beginning. The Zarax were not a race to be underestimated. Solara, too, was feeling the weight of the growing war. The victory was important, yes, but it had not ended the conflict. The Zarax were ruthless, and they would not stop just because they had suffered a single defeat. The Vakar forces had gained an advantage, but it was fragile. She had seen too many battles turn in an instant to allow herself to be lulled into false confidence. Still, for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The alliance between the humans and the Vakar had proven stronger than either side had expected. Liam, with his unusual strategies and understanding of tactics, was quickly becoming a vital part of the war effort. And even though their marriage had been built on duty, not love, there was something between them now, a mutual respect, a bond forged in the fires of battle. Each day they grew closer, not just as rulers and diplomats, but as two people who were learning to rely on one another. It was a strange kind of relationship, born out of necessity, yet slowly transforming into something deeper. Neither of them was ready to admit it, but the changes were undeniable. One afternoon, as the Vakar capital buzzed with preparations for the next phase of the war, Liam and Solara found themselves alone in a quiet chamber. The walls of the room were lined with maps and holographic displays, showing the positions of the enemy and the strengths and weaknesses of the Vakar forces. The room was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of the maps and the flickering flames from a nearby hearth. Liam was studying one of the displays, his brow furrowed as he traced the movements of the Zarax across the map. The lines of the enemy's advance were fast, cutting across space like a storm. There was no time to waste. They had to act quickly if they were to prevent the Zarax from reaching the inner systems. Solara entered the room quietly, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. She stood behind Liam for a moment, watching him as he concentrated on the map. The Vakar queen had always been a warrior at heart, but she had never seen strategy and tactics like this. Liam's mind worked differently from the Vakar generals, more creatively, more human. It was something that made him stand out among the Vakar leaders, something that had already changed the course of the war. "You're not sleeping," Solara said, breaking the silence. Liam glanced up at her, his eyes tired but focused. "There's no time for sleep. The Zarax won't wait for us to rest." Solara walked to his side, her eyes following the movements on the map. "You've given us a chance, a real one." Liam shook his head slightly, not taking his eyes off the display. "A chance isn't enough. We need to strike fast before they can regroup. We have to outsmart them, get ahead of their next move." "I know," Solara said, her voice soft. "But you've done more than anyone could have expected. You've turned the tide." There was a brief silence between them, as the weight of her words hung in the air. Liam did not reply immediately. He was still focused on the map, but in his mind, he was replaying the events of the past few days. The victories, the challenges, the moments when he had felt like a stranger in an alien world. "I'm not a warrior, Solara," Liam said quietly. "I don't belong here." Solara studied him for a moment. "You belong here because you've earned it. Not because of your title or your marriage, but because you've proven yourself. You've led us to victory. That's more than any crown or throne could ever do." Liam looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. There was something about the way she said it, something that made him believe she truly meant it. "Maybe," he replied, though doubt still lingered in his words. "But I'm not the one who should be leading. I'm not even from this world." Solara was silent for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "None of us are truly from this world, not anymore." Her words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. The war had changed them all. They had become part of something bigger, something that didn't care about where they came from, only what they could do, what they could give. And in that moment, Liam realized that he had already given more than he ever thought possible. "I've never fought a war like this before," Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never had to make decisions that could end lives. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Solara took a step closer, her gaze steady. You don't have to fight alone, I'm with you. And so are the people who believe in you. Liam looked at her, and for the first time he saw the queen not just as a ruler, but as a person, as someone who was also carrying the weight of the war on her shoulders. He had been so focused on his own doubts, his own struggles, that he hadn't seen how much she was suffering. I don't know what the future holds, he said finally, his voice stronger now. But I'll keep fighting for you, for Earth, for everyone who needs us. Solara nodded, her eyes softening. And I'll keep fighting too. We'll win this war together. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The next phase of the war would be the most dangerous yet. The Zaraks were regrouping, building their strength, and the Vakar had to move fast if they were to keep their advantage. Liam and Solara worked together, using every resource at their disposal to prepare their forces. The alliance between the humans and the Vakar had grown stronger, and now it was time to put their combined strength to the test. The night before the final battle, Liam stood alone on the balcony of the palace, looking out over the city. The air was crisp, and the stars above seemed to shine with an intensity that mirrored the thoughts in his mind. The war had become personal for him now. He wasn't just fighting for peace anymore. He was fighting for something deeper. He was fighting for the people he had come to care for the Vakar, for Solara. A soft sound behind him broke his thoughts, and he turned to see Solara standing in the doorway. She was dressed in her battle armor, the silver gleam of the plates catching the light from the stars. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. Liam took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know if anyone can ever be ready for this." Solara walked up to him, her gaze never leaving his. "We don't have to be ready, we just have to do what we must." Liam nodded, his heart racing. He had never asked for this role, never wanted to lead a war. But now it felt like a part of him had been forged in the flames of battle. He had changed, they both had. "Together," he said, his voice firm. Solara smiled, a rare expression that softened her usual stern features. Together. The battle the next day would determine the future of the galaxy. But Liam knew that, no matter the outcome, he and Solara had already won something more. They had won each other's trust, and that would be their greatest weapon in the days to come. The night before the final battle, a quiet unease had settled over the Vakar capital. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of celebration, were now empty, save for the occasional patrol marching to their posts. The city had been a symbol of strength for the Vakar people, but now it seemed more like a fragile fortress on the edge of destruction. Everyone knew that tomorrow would decide the fate of the galaxy. The Vakar and human forces would make their stand against the Zaraks in a battle that would be remembered for centuries, win or lose. Liam stood at the edge of the balcony once more, gazing out at the dark sky. The stars seemed distant, almost cold. They were a reminder of how far he had come from Earth, and yet how small he felt in this vast universe. He had become something he never thought he would be, a soldier, a leader, a symbol of hope for two species on the brink of war. He had always been a man of words, of negotiation and diplomacy. But now he had to lead soldiers, command fleets, and make decisions that would cost lives. It was a heavy responsibility, one that had weighed on him since the first battle he had fought. He had never imagined himself as a warrior, and yet here he was, standing at the crossroads of history, uncertain of what the next day would bring. Solara, too, was preparing for the battle in her own way. As the queen of the Vakar, she carried the burden of leadership every day, but tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would lead her people into the most dangerous battle they had ever fought. The Zaraks were ruthless, and the Vakar had no choice but to strike first or risk losing everything they had fought for. She stood in front of a large window in her chambers, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The silver armor she wore reflected the light of the moon, a stark contrast to the dark night around her. Despite the preparations, the tension in her chest remained. She had always been a warrior at heart, but this was different. This was personal. Liam had become more than just her political ally. He had become her partner in this fight. In the beginning, their marriage had been nothing more than a duty, a way to ensure peace between their people. But now it had evolved into something more. They had fought together, bled together, and shared moments of uncertainty. And now she knew she couldn't face the battle without him. She walked across the room and paused behind Liam on the balcony. She could see the same unease in his posture, the same worry in his eyes. The quiet that had settled over the city only seemed to amplify the feeling that they were on the edge of something monumental. "We don't have to be ready, you know," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "None of us are truly ready for what's coming." Liam turned to face her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not sure anyone ever is," he replied. She studied him for a moment, noticing the slight tension in his shoulders, the furrow in his brow. The same doubts that had haunted her in the early days of the war seemed to be weighing on him now. She knew the burden of leadership all too well. "You've led us this far," she said, her tone resolute. "Your mind, your strategies, they've saved us more times than I can count. You're more than just a diplomat, Liam. You're the reason we have a chance." Liam shook his head slightly, but there was no denying the truth in her words. He had become something more than just a diplomat, more than just a husband. He had become a leader, a figure of hope for two species who had once been at odds. But even as the words of praise echoed in his mind, doubt still gnawed at him. "What if it's not enough?" he asked softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What if we're too late? What if the Zaraks are stronger than we think?" Solara stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then we fight anyway. We fight because it's the only choice we have left." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of experience. She had seen battles lost and won, watched her people rise from the ashes of defeat. She knew the cost of war, but she also knew the price of doing nothing. "I never wanted any of this," Liam said quietly. "I never wanted to be a soldier. I never wanted to lead armies. I was just a diplomat." Solara nodded, understanding. She had never wanted to be queen, never wanted to be the one who made decisions that could mean life or death for her people. But like Liam, she had no choice but to accept the role she had been given. "We don't always get to choose our paths," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But we choose how we walk them." Liam looked at her, his expression softening. He had heard her words before, but tonight they felt different. There was something in the way she spoke, something in her presence that made him feel like maybe they were both walking this path together, not as strangers or enemies, but as allies, as partners. He had once believed that this war, this marriage, was nothing more than a burden. But now, standing beside her, he realized that it had become something else. They had become a team, a force that could shape the future of the galaxy. The night passed slowly, each hour stretching out like an eternity. They spent the remaining time preparing, reviewing battle strategies, finalizing their plans for the offensive. But even as they worked, the uncertainty of the coming battle hung over them like a cloud. The morning of the battle arrived with the first light of dawn. The air was thick with tension as the Vakar and human forces gathered in the war room, waiting for the signal to move. The room was filled with Vakar generals, human commanders, and soldiers, all waiting for the word to begin. Solara and Liam stood at the head of the room, their eyes fixed on the holographic map of the battlefield. The Zaraks had gathered their forces in a defensive position, preparing for a final stand. It was a do-or-die moment for both sides. Liam looked at the map, his mind running through the plans they had laid out over the past few days. It was a dangerous strategy, relying on precision and speed to catch the Zaraks off guard. But he knew that it was their best shot. If they could break through the Zaraks' defenses, they would have a chance at victory. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Zaraks would overrun the Vakar Empire, and Earth would be next. Solara turned to Liam, her gaze steady. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of the pressure she was feeling. Liam met her eyes and nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." Solara gave a small nod in return and turned to address the room. "Today, we fight for the future of the galaxy. We fight for our people. We fight together." The room erupted in cheers, the soldiers rallying around her words. But even in the face of such unity, Liam could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The future of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. As they made their way to the command center, the air was filled with the sounds of soldiers preparing for battle. The ships were ready, the weapons loaded, and the battle plans set into motion. Liam and Solara stood together at the front of the command room, watching as the holographic displays flickered with information. The first wave of Vakar and human forces moved out, and the battle began. The sound of ships launching filled the air, followed by the roar of weapons firing. The battlefield was chaos, a blur of flashing lights and explosions as both sides clashed in a deadly struggle for supremacy. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the battle unfold. The Vakar forces, led by their queen, were holding their ground, but the Zarax were relentless. Their tactics were brutal, and the battle was fierce. As the battle raged on, Liam's mind raced. He had led them this far, but now it was up to them to finish it. The stakes had never been higher. There was no turning back, and in the midst of the chaos, he realized something. No matter the outcome, this was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a fight for hope, for the future of two worlds, for something bigger than any one of them. He glanced at Solara, standing strong by his side, her eyes focused on the battle. He didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. The battle had begun in full force, and the air was thick with the hum of energy weapons and the crackle of explosions. The skies were filled with ships, both Vakar and human, darting between one another, weaving in and out of enemy fire. Below, the ground trembled with the movements of massive war machines, marching forward to clash with the advancing Zarax forces. The din of the conflict was overwhelming, but amidst the chaos, Liam kept his focus. Standing in the command center, Liam's eyes were locked on the battle unfolding on the holographic map. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of thousands of lives hanging in the balance. The first wave had gone as planned, quick, efficient, and calculated. But as the battle continued, the situation grew more unpredictable. The Zarax were relentless, their strength and numbers overwhelming, and Liam knew they couldn't hold out forever. They needed a decisive strike. Solara stood beside him, her eyes sharp as she followed every movement on the screen. Despite the gravity of the situation, there was a calmness to her. It was the calm of a leader who had fought many battles and had learned to trust in her instincts. She was every bit the queen, but in this moment she was also a soldier, a fighter just like Liam. Liam glanced at her, his face set in determination. "We need to push them back. We can't let them take the upper hand." Solara nodded, her voice steady. "We're close, just a little longer." It had been hours since the battle began, and already the Vakar forces were beginning to feel the pressure. The Zarax were fierce, their advanced weapons cutting through the Vakar lines with frightening precision. But the humans had something the Zarax had underestimated: creativity. Liam's unconventional strategies had kept them one step ahead for much of the fight. His quick thinking had turned the tide in several key moments, but now the situation was more desperate than ever. Suddenly, an alert flashed on the screen. Liam's heart skipped a beat as he saw the Zarax forces pulling back to form a new line. They were regrouping, preparing for a final stand. This was it, the critical moment that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Liam's mind raced. He knew what they had to do, but it was a risky move. They would have to move fast, hit the Zarax where they least expected it. The question was whether or not they could pull it off. There was no room for error. "We need to break their formation," Liam said, turning to Solara. "If we can hit them from the rear, we can force them to retreat." Solara's eyes met his, and for a moment they stood in silence. This was the kind of decision that could make or break them. If they succeeded, it would be a victory that would echo across the galaxy. But if they failed, "If we fail, we lose everything," Solara said quietly. Liam nodded. "But if we don't take this chance, we'll never have another shot." The Vakar Queen didn't hesitate. She understood the stakes just as well as he did. "Make it happen." Liam turned to the command center, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "Send the human and Vakar forces to the rear flank. Use the speed of our ships to get ahead of their line, then strike when they least expect it. We hit them hard and we hit them fast." The orders were sent out immediately, and within moments the forces began to move. The command center hummed with activity as the team worked quickly to adjust their strategy in real time. It was all happening in the blink of an eye. The final strike was underway. Liam's pulse quickened as he watched the ships move into position. He had no doubt that the Zarax would try to counterattack once they realized what was happening. This was their last chance to win. If the strike failed, the Vakar would be doomed, and if they were doomed, Earth would follow soon after. Solara stood next to him, her gaze fixed on the unfolding events. "I trust you, Liam. Do what you do best." Liam took a deep breath and nodded. "We're all in this together." The final strike began. The Vakar and human forces moved with precision, surrounding the Zarax from all sides. The Zarax tried to regroup, but it was too late. Liam's plan was working. The Vakar ships swept in from the rear, firing on the Zarax's exposed flank. The battle was now a storm of blinding light, lasers, and explosions as the two forces collided in a frenzy of destruction. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Liam watched as the battle unfolded on the holographic map, his mind processing every move in real time. The Vakar forces were pushing the Zarax back, their line crumbling under the pressure of the surprise attack. The tide was shifting in their favor. But just as Liam allowed himself a brief moment of relief, another alert flashed on the screen. A new wave of Zarax ships appeared on the edge of the battlefield, far larger than anything they had faced so far. They had underestimated the enemy's reserves. The final wave of Zarax forces had arrived, and it was a formidable sight. The Vakar forces were not prepared for this. Liam's stomach sank. The battle was far from over. The new Zarax forces would tip the scales in the enemy's favor if they didn't act fast. "We've got to hold them off," Liam said, his voice tense. "We can't let them get close to our lines. If they break through, everything we've fought for will be lost." Solara stepped forward, her voice resolute. "We won't let them win." Liam nodded, rallying the troops in his mind. The battle wasn't over yet, but they still had one advantage: their unity. They had fought together this far, and they couldn't give up now, not when victory was within reach. The fight raged on, both sides pushing and pulling, each trying to gain the upper hand. The Vakar and human forces held their ground as best they could, but the sheer size of the Zarax fleet was overwhelming. The new wave was like a flood, and the Vakar were struggling to keep them at bay. But then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, a new signal came through. It was a fleet of reinforcements. The Vakar Royal Fleet, led by Solara's most trusted commanders, had arrived. Liam's eyes widened as he saw the ships on the edge of the battlefield. The arrival of the Royal Fleet was the final piece they needed. With their forces combined, the Vakar and human armies surged forward once again, pushing the Zarax forces back and reclaiming lost ground. The Zarax, now outnumbered and outgunned, began to retreat. It was over. The battle was won. Liam stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The sounds of battle were slowly fading, replaced by the cheers of victory from both the Vakar and human forces. It had been a brutal, grueling fight, but they had won. Against all odds, they had triumphed. Solara approached him, her face weary but determined. She had seen too many battles to show weakness now. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of relief, relief that they had made it through, relief that they had saved their people. "We did it," Liam said, his voice a little hoarse from the strain of the battle. Solara nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. "Yes." "We did." Liam looked around, taking in the aftermath of the battle. The galaxy had been saved, but at a great cost. Many lives had been lost, but the sacrifice had been worth it. They had stopped the Zarax invasion. They had secured the future of both the Vakar and Earth. For the first time since the war began, Liam allowed himself a moment of peace. He had come to this distant galaxy as a diplomat, unsure of his place, and now he had helped to save it. He had found something he hadn't expected: a new purpose, new friends, and even a new kind of family. As the Vakar and human forces celebrated their victory, Solara turned to Liam, her eyes softening with gratitude. "You didn't just lead us to victory," she said quietly. "You gave us hope, you gave us a future." Liam smiled at her, feeling the weight of their shared journey. "We gave it to each other." Together they stood amidst the victory, knowing that the war was over and the future was theirs to shape. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the galaxy, and for them.